For centuries, the gavel came down hard on what was and wasn't sacred. Colossal institutions dictated the rules of the game. They controlled with an iron fist which pages you could read, and which ones should turn to dust. We thought we had the whole playbook in our hands, didn't we? They made a brutal miscalculation. Nobody counted on an unforgiving desert holding a time-proof secret. 2,000 years ago, an entire library of forbidden scriptures and original documents was locked away in the pitch black of suffocating caves. These scrolls didn't just survive the march of empires and the carnage of wars. They rose from the sands to bring to light the sacred texts that history, against all odds, tried to wipe out forever. The great irony of history is that the biggest discoveries rarely happen when the suits in science are out looking for them. Forget million-dollar expeditions or digs funded by big shots. The greatest theological and scientific earthquake of the 20th century didn't start in a modern lab or under a magnifying glass. It started with a stumble, with pure, blind luck. Or, for those keeping their eyes wide open, with divine providence acting in broad daylight. Let's go back to 1947. The world was still picking up the pieces from World War II, but out in the desert, life was the same old grind. Picture the barren cliffs of Qumran, right by the heavy, salty waters of the Dead Sea. A blazing sun, cracked earth, and that absolute silence that actually rings in your ears. In this brutal setting, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib was wandering the rocks. He couldn't care less about prophecies or theology. He was just doing his back-breaking work. In a careless moment, a goat strays from the herd and vanishes into the limestone slopes. Annoyed and huffing in the heat, the kid climbs after the animal. In the middle of this exhausting chase, his eye catches a dark slit in the rock, a cave that seemed to swallow the light. On pure instinct, or out of that boyhood curiosity we never really lose, he picks up a rock and hurls it inside, figuring it would scare the runaway goat. But what he heard made his blood run cold for a split second. It wasn't the dull thud of stone hitting stone. It was a sharp crash, the unmistakable sound of ancient pottery shattering into pieces. The kid's heart jumped into his throat. Back then, the desert was full of legends about hidden treasure, chests of gold coins hastily buried by people fleeing the Romans centuries before. Gold was the only language that mattered out there. Thinking he'd just hit the jackpot, he crawls down into the gloomy cave. As his eyes adjust to the pitch black, he finds himself face to face with tall, sealed clay jars, lined up like sleeping sentinels. With his hands shaking from anticipation, he opens the first one. But what comes out is a total buzzkill. It was just a bunch of dark, musty-smelling bundles, wrapped in rotting linen and coated in sticky pitch. Pieces of leather and papyrus crumbling between his fingers. That rugged shepherd, frustrated that he didn't get rich overnight, had no clue what he was holding in his dirty hands. He was dragging out into the sunlight fragments of the oldest biblical texts ever seen, kept in absolute silence for 2 millennia. Those moldy, foul-smelling scrolls were worth more than all the gold in Rome. They were about to turn the academic world upside down, shut the mouths of arrogant critics, and prove the unshakable accuracy of the Word of God. The voices of the past, muffled by the dust of time, were about to speak again. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, I have a heartfelt request. If you value the scriptures and love seeing the truth prevail, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. While you're at it, drop your name in the comments below. I make it a point to read every single one, and I really want to know who's watching us. Now, settle in, because the people who hid these scrolls were no ordinary folks. The dust settled after the shock of the discovery, But an uncomfortable question kept hanging in the heavy air of Qumran. Who in their right mind would go through the insane trouble of hand-copying, meticulously rolling, sealing with pitch, and hiding thousands of documents in the middle of absolute nowhere? To understand this play, we need to wipe from our minds that well-behaved image of the ancient Jew who just went to the temple, offered sacrifices, and lived quietly under Roman rule. Forget about it. The men who left this library behind weren't everyday citizens, nor were they comfortable priests living high on the hog. They were, by the standards of their time, hardcore radicals. An extremist faction, tough as nails, that history remembers as the Essenes. Think of them as a spiritual elite force, men who looked at the dirty politics of Jerusalem and said, "This place is rotten to the core." To them, the religious leadership was corrupt to the bone, sold out to the Roman machine, mixing faith with convenience. Corruption was running wild in the holy city, and the Essenes wanted zero part in that hypocrisy. The choice they made was drastic, cutting right to the quick. They turned their backs on the comforts of civilization and marched straight into the belly of the Judean Desert. They went to live where simply surviving felt like a punishment, a place where the earth cracks from the drought and the sun takes no prisoners. But get this, to them that brutal isolation wasn't a penalty. It was a purifier. Out there, they forged a closed-off community, bound by a code that would make any army cry uncle. They plunged into freezing water for purification, broke bread together, and above all, spent the dead of night copying the scriptures. The quill never stopped scratching against the papyrus. And what drove this almost sickening dedication? The unshakable belief that mankind's destiny was about to run out of time. They weren't waiting for a Messiah in some poetic, metaphorical way. They believed with every fiber of their being that God's judgment was going to kick the door down at any second. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, the sons of light, meaning themselves. On the other, the sons of darkness. Their mission was to be the ark, saving the word before the storm hit. And the storm didn't take long. Except it didn't come tearing through the sky. It came marching in with short swords and red shields. The year was 68 AD. The Jewish revolt against Rome had blown up, and Caesar didn't take things lying down. The Roman legions rolled down the map like a steamroller, crushing cities and leaving a trail of blood in their wake. The ground shook under the boots of the infantry. The black smoke from burning villages was already staining the horizon of Qumran. The Essenes knew the Roman general would be on their doorstep in a matter of days. There would be no talking, no mercy. It was the end of the line. With death knocking at their door, instead of hiding gold or running for their lives to save their own skin, their only concern was bulletproofing the sacred text. Working at a feverish pace in the midst of total panic, they wrapped the scrolls tight against the damp. Scaling the cliffs under the cover of darkness, they stashed a lifetime of work in unreachable gorges. They died shortly after, cut down by the blades of the empire. Their camp was reduced to ashes. But that final act of desperation guaranteed that the scriptures wouldn't die. They mocked the emperors from the shadows, waiting in the dark for the exact right time. Before that, shepherd tripped over clay jars in the desert. A total mockery fest was running wild in the halls of major universities. If you walked into an academic debate before 1947, you were bound to hear the big wigs of science beating their chests, claiming the Bible was nothing more than a poorly stitched patchwork quilt. Their argument sounded pretty, it was well articulated, and it convinced a lot of people. They used the classic telephone game theory. You definitely remember that game. The one where somebody whispers a phrase into the first person's ear, and by the time the message reaches the end of the line, the story has completely changed into a jumbled mess. Well, the armchair critics claimed the scriptures suffered from that exact same disease, and they had a heavy trump card to back up that arrogant accusation. Up until that historic moment, the oldest complete copy of the Old Testament in Hebrew that mankind had its hands on was the so-called Leningrad Codex, dating back to around the year 1000 AD. Do the math. We're talking about a colossal gap of at least 1,000 years between the days of the original prophets and the oldest paper available in libraries. 1,000 years of exhausted scribes copying texts, endless translations passing from hand to hand. To the skeptical mind, the equation was fatal. It was humanly impossible that the Bible hadn't been torn apart, patched up, and corrupted to benefit the powerful over the centuries. For the intellectual elite of the time, believing in the purity of the Bible was just plain naive. They swore up and down that the original text had been flushed down the drain of history. But then, the sands of Qumran spat those dark, moldy bundles out into the daylight. When the first fragments hit the lab tables and ran the ruthless gauntlet of carbon-14 testing, the skeptics' smug smiles started to freeze. The lab report dropped like a bombshell, a real punch to the gut for an academic community that thought it had a monopoly on the truth. Those scrolls weren't from the Middle Ages. They weren't from 200 or 500 years ago. They dated all the way back to the 3rd century BC. The radicals of the desert had stashed documents in those suffocating caves that were an astonishing 1,000 years older than any Hebrew Bible we had on the planet. The bridge over that dark abyss of time had been built overnight. That's exactly when the room got heavy. The critics, swallowing hard at the sheer age of the documents, saw this as their chance to play their final card. They figured if they put the modern Bible side by side with these original scrolls, they would prove once and for all that the current text is a total sham full of medieval fairy tales. The stage was set for the greatest public humiliation in the history of Christianity. The spotlight fiercely zeroed in on the crown jewel of Qumran, the Great Isaiah Scroll, a leather document over 23 feet long, holding the complete prophecies, preserved almost entirely intact. The sharpest linguists in the world grabbed their magnifying glasses. Translators held their breath. Line by line, letter by letter, they started comparing the 2,000-year-old scroll with the exact same Bible everyday folks carry to church on Sundays. What happened in those dead silent rooms was something that defies human logic. The level of pinpoint accuracy shut the mouth of every last critic. There was no shift in doctrine, no fake miracles slipped in, no political tampering. Just to give you an idea, the experts dissected the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. Out of the 166 words in the entire chapter, only 17 letters were different between the Qumran scroll and the text copied 1,000 years later. And you want to know what those letters were? 10 of them were just spelling variations, like spelling a word with PH back in the day and with an F today. Zero impact on the meaning. The other 7 were purely calligraphy details. The core essence of the text had remained completely bulletproof. That arrogant telephone game theory crumbled right then and there, crushed under the weight of the evidence. The desert preserved undeniable proof, stamped by science itself, that the scriptures had not been tampered with. Those ancient scribes were so terrified of messing up a single comma that their obsession bulletproofed the word. The secular world had to bow its head. Archaeology had validated the Bible and made a mockery of modern skepticism. But if you think this mind-blowing accuracy is the most shocking part, buckle up, because what we're going to reveal next was hidden for a sinister reason. Not everything rescued from those caves made it into the Bibles we read today. You know, to keep from being fooled by people trying to twist history, it's super important to understand the actual timeline of biblical events. With that in mind, I put together something really special for you. A handy digital book mapping out the entire Bible in chronological order, right from Genesis all the way to Revelation. It's a simple, engaging way to keep the behind-the-scenes of the Scriptures right at your fingertips. The link to check it out is right down below in the pinned comment. As soon as this video is over, go take a look. I'm sure you're gonna love it. But right now, I need you to pay close attention to what comes next. If the pinpoint accuracy of the Isaiah scroll felt like a miracle to you, the plot is about to thicken. What we're about to dig up was kept under lock and key for a deeply disturbing reason. The naked truth is, not everything salvaged from those caves landed in the pages of the Bible you have sitting at home. The academic dust had settled, and the religious world was breathing a huge sigh of relief. The great Isaiah scroll proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Bible we read today had been kept faithful through the ages. But if you think the story ends there with a group hug and a happy ending, you better listen closely. Because when researchers kept opening the rest of those rescued jars, that wave of relief gave way to a heavy, unsettling silence in academic circles. The brutal truth is that not everything pulled from those dark crevices in Qumran ended up in the Bible on your bookshelf. The shepherds didn't just find traditional scrolls. They unearthed an entire parallel library, a collection of dark, apocalyptic texts that were, to modern religious leaders, absolutely terrifying. The first punch to the gut came when they unrolled an old piece of leather and came face to face with an incredibly detailed military tactical manual. This manuscript became famous as the War Scroll. Make no mistake, this text wasn't some poetic metaphor about the daily spiritual struggle against sin. It was a literal, battle-ready script for the end of the world. The document lays out, with chilling coldness, the final, ruthless showdown between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. It gives rules of engagement and details exactly how ranks of armed angels would swoop down from the heavens to fight shoulder to shoulder with human troops in the ultimate bloodbath. It describes the piercing blast of metal trumpets tearing through the air and the merciless annihilation wiping out the empire of evil. For that sect of radicals living on the edge of death in the blistering desert heat, the apocalypse wasn't a bedtime story to scare kids. It was tomorrow's inevitable headline. They were literally sharpening their swords, waiting for the sky to crack open. But that was just a warm-up. The real shocker, the documents that made the foundations of the academic world shake, was the discovery of countless copies of highly forbidden books. We're talking about the controversial fragments of the Book of Enoch and the bizarre Book of Giants. Things are about to get deep. You definitely remember that quick passage in chapter 6 of Genesis. In just a few lines, the story says that the sons of God came down to earth, took the daughters of men, and fathered the Nephilim, the famous heroes of old. In the Bible we use today, it breezes by so fast it leaves any Christian scratching their head. But the Dead Sea Scrolls blew the lid off the dark backstory of this event with an unbelievable level of detail. The censored texts of Qumran hold nothing back. They tell the raw story of the great rebellion of the Watchers, a class of angels who made a conscious choice to cross God's line, abandon their heavenly watch, and materialize in our world through a gruesome pact on Mount Hermon. The text exposes how these entities invaded humanity, corrupting the natural order of things. And it gets worse. They handed over forbidden celestial knowledge to humans. They taught our race how to forge swords and shields for slaughter. They brought witchcraft, hardcore occultism, and rituals of seduction. The direct fallout of this cosmic crime was the dreaded Nephilim, literal giants walking the earth. The Book of Giants reports that these freaks of nature had a bestial, out-of-control appetite. When they devoured all the crops and mankind's labor couldn't feed them anymore, they turned on humanity, hunting and eating men in a blood-soaked feast of pure violence. The ancient text, pieced back together in a lab, even recounts the terrifying nightmares of these wicked beings, dreams where the world was swallowed by deep waters. They could already smell the flood coming to wipe them out, a heavy and final judgment from the Creator for ruining the seed of the earth. Now, I need you to ask yourself the question that academics dodge at all costs. Why would an isolated, strict community of Jews, men who died by Roman swords to protect the book of Isaiah, guard the books of Enoch and the giants with the exact same reverent zeal? To them, the physical invasion of fallen angels wasn't folklore. It was pure, sacred, undeniable history. It was the ultimate document explaining the origin of evil, bloodshed, and witchcraft. The level of reverence back then was so high that the Apostle Jude himself makes a point to quote the Book of Enoch in his New Testament letter as an absolutely bulletproof authority. That brings us to the heart of the conspiracy of silence. If these texts shaped how the early church and the ancient Jewish world understood the spiritual universe, why were they ripped from our hands? What happened in those boardrooms during centuries of politics in Rome, and the grand councils that made the men in suits and robes sweep these books down the drain of history? The theory that makes the traditional church cringe is that the raw account of angels genetically mixing with humans became just too embarrassing. It was too awkward for the polished, philosophical, squeaky clean theology that took over the West. The establishment chose to take a pair of scissors to a complex and disturbing past to force-feed a dogma that was much easier to tame. But the desert refused to applaud this censorship. The caves made a mockery of human hierarchy and handed the records of Enoch and the giants back to the world, kicking open the door to a heavy, spiritual reality, one that is way darker and more visceral than any modern Sunday sermon has the guts to teach. The dust from these theological bombshells about angels and giants had barely settled when archaeologists stumbled onto an anomaly that felt straight out of a thriller movie. Up until that point, the pattern of discoveries in Qumran was pretty predictable. Sacred texts, community rules, and apocalyptic prophecies, all carefully copied in ink on pieces of animal skin or fragile sheets of papyrus. It was material for study, for faith, and for spiritual warfare. But what was waiting in the dark of Cave 3 broke absolutely every rule in the book. There, resting under centuries of heavy dust, the explorers didn't find a soft scroll. They came face to face with two heavy cylinders, completely oxidized and turned green by time. It was solid metal. The academic world was now staring at the indecipherable manuscript 3Q15, which would go down in history under a much darker, more intriguing name: the Copper Scroll. The tension went through the roof. This bizarre object couldn't just be unrolled like the other organic parchments. The copper had calcified over 20 centuries and was so brittle that if they tried to force it open by hand, the metal would crumble to dust, destroying the message forever. The fix required surgical lab precision. The artifact was shipped under heavy security to the University of Manchester in England. There, an engineer designed a tiny saw customized specifically to slice the scroll into 23 perfect sections, cracking the metal open like a dried-out shell. When the pieces were laid side by side, and the experts finally started translating the Hebrew, brutally hammered into the metal cold, the academic community's jaw hit the floor. That document didn't talk about religion. It didn't mention God, there were no psalms, and it completely ignored the apocalypse. The Copper Scroll was, in the most literal and raw way possible, a treasure map. And we're not talking about a few loose coins dropped by a careless merchant. The text, hammered hard into the copper, listed a mind-blowing, methodical inventory. It coldly catalogued 64 hiding spots scattered all over Israel, from the barren desert down to the undergrounds of Jerusalem. The descriptions pointed to absurd tons of silver, mountains of solid gold bars, sacred vessels, precious coins, and stashes of the purest incense. An incalculable fortune that, adjusted for today's economy, would easily hit the billions of dollars. Immediately, the historical context fit like a glove. While General Titus's mighty Roman legions were furiously marching to surround, invade, and wipe out Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, the priestly elite had to make a move out of sheer desperation. The temple housed the accumulated wealth of an entire nation. To keep the sacred vaults from falling into the profane hands of the empire, only to be melted down to fund Caesar's own war machine, a titanic effort was orchestrated under the cover of night. Trusted men buried the riches deep in the earth, stashing gold in dry aqueducts, under burial monuments, and inside disguised cisterns. The record of all this heavy lifting wasn't carved on leather, which would have gone up in smoke in the first Roman fire, but in unforgiving copper, built to survive the fires of war. That's when the modern gold rush kicked off. Adventurers, big-name archaeologists, and even bounty hunters caught the scent of wealth. High-dollar expeditions were slapped together in a hurry. They had the map right in their hands. It felt like only a matter of days before someone shoved a shovel into the dirt and dug up a biblical fortune. But the Copper Scroll held one final, ruthless defense against looters. The disturbing detail is that the author didn't use modern GPS coordinates. He wrote down instructions that would only make sense to someone living in that exact era, walking those exact streets. The directions were a nightmare of geographical sadism. The text said things like, "In the large cistern that is in the court of the peristyle at the bottom, hidden in a hole, 800 talents of silver." Or, "In the monument of Absalom, on the west side, dig 12 cubits." It's a cruel puzzle. The court of the peristyle turned to rubble 2 millennia ago. The exact shape of the valleys shifted thanks to merciless earthquakes and endless rebuilding. Ruins were swallowed up by new cities, and ancient tombs vanished under modern asphalt. The location code of the Copper Scroll became a dead language, a sarcastic joke from the past. Even today, with the help of satellites, ground-penetrating radar, and cutting-edge laser mapping, the search results are nothing but painful frustration. Nobody has been able to crack the exact spots. Not a single ounce of that sacred gold has ever been recovered. The temple's billion-dollar treasure is still sitting exactly where the ancients left it, bulletproofed by the passage of time and protected by the most baffling map history has ever seen. The earth hid the material wealth, but the real heist they tried to pull off years later involved something way more valuable than gold. The treasure stayed buried, but the Bedouins quickly realized that old leather was worth cold, hard cash. What unfolded next wasn't a careful excavation, but a full-blown geopolitical thriller. Priceless fragments started floating around the black market, smuggled across the Middle East in beat-up shoeboxes. The sheer weirdness reached such an absurd peak that on June 1, 1954, a classified ad popped up in the prestigious Wall Street Journal. Right in the middle of real estate listings, someone had the nerve to post 4 Dead Sea Scrolls for sale, pitching them as an ideal educational gift. Pieces of divine history being hawked like garage sale junk in the financial papers. It forced major institutions to deal directly with smugglers just to buy back our own heritage. But if you think the black market was the big bad wolf, brace yourself for the real gut punch. The biggest backstab didn't come from the desert. It came from guys flashing Ivy League diplomas and wearing tailored suits. As soon as the vast majority of the manuscripts were gathered up and locked away inside the archaeological museum, the doors slammed shut. For decades on end, a tiny committee of academics ran an impenetrable cartel. They took ownership of the fragments like they were the private landlords of the biblical past. They set up an exclusive boys' club that flat out refused to publish the translations, stonewalling any brilliant researcher who wasn't part of their inner circle. The entire religious world was left out in the cold, pressing their noses against the glass. Years turned into decades, and the silence from this ivory tower started stirring up massive unease. After all, when the curtain stays down for that long, paranoia takes the wheel. If the scrolls actually proved the Bible was true, why keep them under lock and key for almost 40 years straight? The rumor mill turned into global hysteria. Trashy, sensationalist books exploded onto the shelves, accusing the Vatican of pulling the strings behind the scenes, purposely burying documents that would destroy the Christian faith. Conspiracy theories swore the scrolls held dark secrets that would bring the church crashing down like a house of cards. The climate of suspicion became absolutely unbearable. The pressure cooker finally blew in the early 90s. A crushing international campaign backed the official committee into a corner. Heavyweight intellectuals put their foot down. Bootleg photos of the manuscripts started leaking to the press, and the scandal went global. Cornered by the public humiliation, the monopoly was forced to cough up the archives and release the publications. When the smoke cleared, it turned out there was no theological cover-up at all. The only monster in the room was the blind pride of vain scholars, wanting to hog the glory of the discovery all to themselves. Mercenary greed tried to sell off history, but the sheer arrogance of modern science came dangerously close to burying the sacred texts forever. When we look back at all the dust history has kicked up, the irony of it all is just monumental. Think about it. Colossal, arrogant empires that thought they'd rule the world forever literally turned to dust beneath our feet. The Roman legions vanished into the wind. The Temple of Jerusalem itself, the absolute epicenter of ancient faith, crumbled until not one stone was left standing on another. Centuries later, vain academics tried at all costs to lock the truth away in dark desk drawers. Everybody thought they held the ultimate control, but the dry air of a lost cave by the Dead Sea got the last laugh. The desert made a mockery of human arrogance, keeping the scriptures completely intact and handing us the exact words people read back in the day. The truth runs on its own clock, and it doesn't ask permission from the powers that be to come to light. It's staggering to think how Providence used crude clay pots to bulletproof these texts against censorship and forgery. Now, I want to hear your honest take on everything we've dug up today. Out of all the things the desert hid for 2 millennia, which mystery blew your mind the most? Was it the terrifying revelation of the fallen angel's invasion detailed by Enoch? Was it the undeniable mathematical precision of the book of Isaiah that shut the critics up once and for all? Or was it the thriller movie vibe of the Copper Scroll, with a map to a billion-dollar treasure that is still buried under Israeli soil right this second? Drop your answer in the comments below, because our conversation keeps going down there. And if this journey back in time hit home for you, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel right now so we can keep uncovering the truths that history tried to wipe out. Take care, and God bless.